Quite the opposite of today's Romans that do everything with a laugh. Ancient Romans took everything very seriously. Especially when they decided an enemy was to be destroyed, they didn't just go to war without giving them respite, whatever the cost. But once the enemy was defeated, they wouldn't leave a wall standing. A particularly harsh treatment was reserved for the Etruscans when, after suffering humiliation after humiliation, the Romans felt strong enough to challenge them. It was a long conflict, no holds barred, but the vanquished was left without the eyes to weep with. Rarely in history a civilization has been wiped from the face of the earth by another with such ferocity. It's because of this that next to nothing is left of the Etruscans. All that survives is a few pieces of art and a few thousand inscriptions. On these very few elements, several hypotheses have been built. For starters, nobody knows where they came from. From the way they depicted themselves in bronze statues and terracotta vases, it seems that they were stouter than the villanovians, with features that remind of the Anatolian people. Many do state that it's likely that they came from that area, sailing their way across the Mediterranean Sea. That is supported by the fact that of the italic civilisations, they were the first to have a fleet. It is certain that they named Tirreno, which means Etruscan, the sea that washes the Tuscan coast. Maybe they arrived en masse and overran the local population. Maybe there were only a few of them and they subjugated the locals with their more advanced weapons and techniques. Their civilization was more advanced than the Villanovians, and that is a fact proven by skulls found in the tombs, which were sporting quite refined dental prosthetics. Teeth are a great sign of a population's lifestyle. They deteriorate with progress, which makes improved dentistry necessary. The Etruscans already were familiar with the dental bridge to support their molars, and with the metals needed to build it. They didn't only know iron, which they mined in the Isola d'Elba, and which they made into steel, but also copper, tin, and amber. The cities they immediately built inland, Tarquinia, Arezzo, Perugia, Veio, were much more modern than the villages founded by the Latins and the other Villanovian populations. All had defensive bastions, roads, and most importantly, sewage systems. They planned their cities giving this task to engineers, who were top-notch for those times, where other people just let their cities grow organically, in more than one sense. They organized for collective work of public utility, and proof of that are the canals that they dug to drain the malaria-infested marshes. Most of all, though, they were formidable merchants, quite attached to money and ready to any sacrifice to multiply their wealth. The Romans still didn't know what was beyond Mount Sorate, a small mountain not far from their city, and the Etruscans had already reached Piemonte, Lombardia, and Veneto, and had passed the Alps, and using the Rhone and the Rhine, had taken their wares to the French, Swiss, and German markets, exchanging them with the local products. They were the ones that imported into Italy currency as a medium of exchange, which the Romans copied, so much so that they still had a ship's prow on their coins before ever building a real ship. They were jovial people who took the most enjoyable side of life, and this is why they lost against the Romans, who took life with much more austerity. The scenes depicted on their vases and their tombs show us well-dressed people with that toga that Romans copied, making it their national costume. They had long hair and beringed beards with many jewels on their wrists, necks, and fingers, always intent on drinking, eating, and discussing when they weren't practicing one of their sports. These were mostly boxing, discus throwing, javelin, wrestling, polo, and bullfighting. Naturally, the rules of these games were different from today's. The spectacle of the fight between bull and man in the arena was highly thought of, so much so that the dead were given pictures of these games painted on vases, so they could enjoy the spectacle even on the other side. One great step forward compared to the Roman traditions and those of the other local populations was in women's condition. Women had great freedom among the Etruscans, and in fact they are depicted next to men enjoying the same pleasures. Apparently they were beautiful women. and what today would be described as liberated. In the paintings, they're shown with plenty of jewelry, with makeup, and with little consideration of modesty. They ate and drank with their men, reclining on ample sofas. One of them became very important in Rome and was very knowledgeable of mathematics and medicine. That means that, as opposed to their Latin counterparts, who lived in the darkest ignorance, they went to school and studied. The Romans, moralists as they were, called Tuscan all the women of easy virtue. In one of Plauto's comedies, a girl is accused of following the Tuscan tradition because she's a prostitute. Religion is always the projection of a population's morals, and for the Etruscans this was no different. It was centered around a god called Tinia, who exercised his power through thunder and lightning. He didn't govern earthly affairs directly, but through a sort of executive cabinet of 12 gods, so powerful that it was sacrilege to even pronounce their names. Altogether, they formed the great tribunal of the afterlife, where the genii, I suppose at this point I described them as a sort of civil servant, took the souls of the dead. Those who couldn't prove they had lived according to the will of the gods were condemned to hell, unless the family and friends did enough sacrifices to atone for these misdeeds. In this case, the soul was ushered into heaven to continue and enjoy the lifetime of pleasures, drink, food, music, and sport that he had depicted in vases that were buried with him. They didn't talk much about heaven, though, keeping it rather vague. Possibly this is because too few actually went there to know anything more precisely about it. They were very well informed on hell, though, of which they knew every torment that was inflicted. Obviously, the Etruscan priests thought that threats of violence were more effective than the promise of pleasure to keep people on the straight and narrow. This point of view has changed very little in the centuries and has followed us until now, where we see Christians talk a lot more about the threat of hell than the reward of heaven. We shouldn't take from this that the Etruscans were nice flowers of gentleness, though. They killed with relative ease, even if with the good intention of offering the victim in sacrifice for the benefit of a relative or a friend. It was mainly prisoners of war that were used this way. 300 Romans that were captured in one of the many battles with Rome were lapidated in Tarquinia, and with their still warm liver, the soothsayers tried to determine the future outcome of the war. They obviously were quite unsuccessful, or they would have quit there and then. In any case, this custom was quite frequent, even if usually they used the innards of an animal, and the Romans copied this too, obviously. Politically speaking, their cities never managed to unite, and there was never one powerful enough to dominate the others, like Rome did with its Latin and Sabine rivals. There was a federation dominated by Tarquinia, but it couldn't sort out the separatist tendencies. The 12 little states that were part of it, instead of uniting against the common enemy, let themselves be beaten separately one at a time. All of this has been reconstructed through induction from the remains of Etruscan art that have reached us, which are the whole legacy left of that civilization. It's mostly vases and bronze statues. Among these vases, there are some seriously beautiful ones, such as Veio's Apollo, also known as the Walking Apollo, made of multicolored terracotta that shows great technical expertise and a refined taste. However few these remains are, they're enough to let us know how the Romans, who had suffered the Etruscan superiority, especially in technical and organizational fields, and learned as much as possible from them. Once they overwhelmed them, they didn't just destroy them, they tried to erase every trace of their civilization. They considered it sick and corrupting. They copied from them all that they found useful. They sent their children to the schools of Veio and Tarquinia to learn especially about engineering and medicine. They copied the toga, they started using currency, perhaps they copied the political system too, but the Etruscans had this in common with many other populations in the peninsula. They passed from a monarchic regime to a republican one, led by a lucumone, an elected magistrate, and then to a form of democracy led by the richest classes. Their own customs, stoic and healthy, based on sacrifice and social discipline, The Romans did their best to preserve them from the softness of the Etruscan ones. Instinctively, they felt that winning the war and occupying the enemy's lands wasn't enough if you allowed them to contaminate the conqueror's home by taking them on as slaves or teachers, as was the custom at the time with the vanquished. They destroyed the enemy and buried all of their documents and monuments. This, though, happened long after first contact between the two populations, and they met in Rome when the Alba-Longans arrived and found a small Etruscan outpost already bearing an Etruscan name. It seems that Roma came from Rumon, that means river in Etruscan. If this is true, we must deduce that the first population of the Urbe was formed not only of Latins and Sabines, people of the same blood, as the story of the rape of the Sabines would lead us to think, but also Etruscans, people of a completely different ethnicity, language and religion. According to some historians, even Romulus himself was Etruscan, and in any case, Etruscan was the rite with which the city was founded. Digging the ditch with a plough pulled by a white bull and a white cow after 12 birds had flown overhead. The Etruscans, who had a passion for commerce, had already founded a small village on the Tevere when Latins and Sabines arrived. This village probably functioned as a switching and supply station for their routes towards the south. Here, especially in Campania, they had planted rich colonies, Capua, Nola, Pompeii, Ercolano, where the locals, who were Villanovian, came to barter their produce with their industrial products coming from Tuscany. It was difficult from Arezzo and Tarquinia to travel down there. There were no roads, and the region was infested with bandits and ferocious animals. Much easier to sail there, since they were the only ones with a fleet anyway. The trip was long enough though, and it took weeks. The ships were small and can load only a limited amount of provisions, so they needed to have ports along the way to resupply. The mouth of the Tevere, conveniently halfway, provided a bay to refill the hold, and since it was navigable, it provided a useful way of sailing inland to do some business with the Latins and Sabines. The area was dotted with between 30 and 70 settlements, each of which was a market. Not rich markets, the only resource available was wood from the lush woods, and they couldn't even offer wheat, since all they had was a small quantity of spelt, wine and olives. It was enough to do a little bit of business on the way to richer markets. For this reason, Rome was founded, with this name or another. They didn't give the event much importance. Who knows how many Romes there were along the Tyrrhenian coast between Livorno and Naples. A garrison of sailors and merchants looked after the settlement, probably considering it a punishment. It's likely that the main duty was maintenance of the docks and the warehouses to handle the incoming ships. One day the Latins and Sabines arrived, maybe because they were feeling a bit tight at home, probably because they too wanted to do some business with the Etruscans. That they already had a strategic plan for the conquest of the world is a fantasy that some recent historians have held. Those Latins and Sabines were yokels for whom geography meant the path between their hut and their field. It is likely that these groups of newcomers clashed with each other. It is just as likely that instead of attacking each other, they allied to face up to the Etruscans, who must have looked down on them, a bit like the English looked down on the natives in their colonies. In front of those strangers who looked down on them, speaking an incomprehensible language, they must have found a kinship bound together by their blood, language and poverty. And they must have pooled what little they had, women. The famous rape of the Sabines is probably the symbol of this arrangement, from which the Etruscans were obviously excluded. Not that they minded, they thought themselves as superior and didn't want to mix with these plebeians ante litteram. The racial division lasted at least 100 years, during which Latins and Sabines, by now merged as Romans, had to swallow plenty of bitter pills. When, after Tarquinio Superbo, who was the last king, they took over, revenge was indiscriminate. Maybe the fury with which they destroyed the Etruscans, not only as a state but as a civilization, was inspired by the humiliations they suffered. They wanted to purge them from history, giving Romulus a Latin origin, and defining as birth of the city the merging of Latins and Sabines.